our Zoom recording and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Vicki. And thank you also for making the language disclaimer so I don't have to. I do also follow a similar philosophy, recognizing that some folks like to be identified by person first language, others identity first language. So throughout my talk, I will kind of go in between, unless I'm talking with a specific audience where the consensus is they prefer one type, and then I will, of course, defer and respect whatever language the audience prefers. But if I don't hear anything, then I'll just kind of interchangeably use person first and identity first language. All right. So I've been introduced. I'd love to get a sense of who all is in this Zoom room. But of course, we're not going to spend time going introducing each one. But if you want to share who you are, your affiliation, kind of what your professional role is, you can throw that in the chat and I can just get a sense of who all is in the room. But thank you for spending your Friday with me. I actually really love talking about this topic. Because I assume that most of us who choose this field, who are in special education, we're dedicated to improving lives of individuals with disabilities, and we recognize the important role that research plays in our pursuit of providing effective instruction, effective high quality instruction to our students. Because after all, and I am biased, but I do firmly believe that education is our best hope of achieving educational outcomes for learners with disabilities. And the good news is that we have lots of great evidence-based practices, and the research continues to add to the space. And I assume that many of us in this room are well-versed in some of these evidence-based practices and may feel quite adept at advocating for using evidence-based practices as the basis for their instruction. But this may not be sufficient all by itself, because we know that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that can oftentimes lead consumers to develop what I refer to as false beliefs about what is and what is not effective. And that means that simply endorsing evidence-based practice in and of itself may not be sufficient. And as educational professionals, we also have to be prepared to address misinformation that can lead consumers to trust and use unsubstantiated practices that are less likely to result in the outcomes we would like to see. All right, so I'm just kind of scrolling through the chat. So lots of BCBAs, right? Research lab manager, Kate, wonderful. Great, we have some faculty, good, all right. All right, so let's get going. So at the start, I want to just clarify some terms that you might hear throughout my talk. So you'll hear the word misinformation a lot. So misinformation simply refers to information that's spread either kind of by mistake or that is erroneous, sometimes by mistake and sometimes with the intent to actually mislead. When there is an intent to mislead, it's actually called disinformation. I choose to believe that when people put information out there that's wrong, that it's kind of by mistake. So I like to refer to it more as misinformation, but there is a different kind of category of information that we call disinformation when it is intentionally meant to mislead. But in our field, I choose to believe that most of it is misinformation, that people are kind of putting information out there that they believe is correct, but may be incorrect when you dig deeper. Okay. The problem is that with misinformation, it can allow us to draw inaccurate conclusions, and in this case about autism. And the conclusions that are drawn from this misinformation is what I'm referring to as false beliefs. Right? So this can cover kind of a range of things. It could be a false belief about kind of what autism is, right? So this false belief that all individuals with autism have savant skills, right? Or it could be kind of a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of kind of data. So a false belief that pollution causes autism, right? Or anything causes autism. Or it could also be a false belief about what is effective in treating autism. So we probably have lots of that to draw from. I do like to always, whenever I talk about this topic, I like to put out a disclaimer that, my intent is never to shame or criticize people who use or, who have fallen kind of susceptible to using non-evidence-based practices or believing misinformation. There's a lot out there, and I truly believe that we are doing the best we can with the information that we're given. So my hope is that I don't come across as criticizing or shaming anyone. But my hope is that we're able to start kind of engaging in a conversation or discuss ways that we as an educational community can help reduce the impact of misinformation, because I really do believe that we're all in it for the same purpose, right? Which is supporting the autistic community. Right. Identified 3 objectives for today's talk. First, I hope that by the end of our conversation today, you'll have a sense for why educational professionals should address autism misinformation, even if it's uncomfortable. Second, that you'll have an understanding of why misinformation thrives, especially in the field of autism. And then finally, some strategies that we can adopt to pre-bunk, so to prevent the spread of misinformation, as well as debunk false beliefs once they're rooted. So let's first talk about why we're even talking about this. Why should educational professionals care about addressing misinformation? Well, most of us, and I know that most of us here are BCBAs, we are, if we look at our professional responsibilities as well as our code of ethics, many of our professional organizations actually have language around using evidence-based practices. And the BACB kind of takes it a step further, right? And that not only are we supposed to be using evidence-based practices, but the BACB actually now has language in their code of ethics to actually address the use of unsubstantiated practices. So let's take a peek at some of the actual language that's in. This is pulled from our BACB code of ethics, and I just pulled out examples, but this type of language occurs throughout many of the codes. Right? So the first is that we are supposed to be using evidence-based practices. Right? So I know that this font is small, so I'll just pull out the language that I think is most impactful here. So as BCBAs, we provide services that are conceptually consistent with behavioral principles based on scientific evidence, right? And designed to maximize outcomes, right? So that term, scientific evidence, that shows up in a lot of the language in our BACB code of ethics. And this is just one example of that, right? So not only are we supposed to be using evidence-based practices, we also are professionally guided to advocate for its use. Right? So it's great that we're using it, but we also need to advocate that others use evidence-based practices. Right? So this is from section 3.3.12. Behavior analysts advocate for and educate clients and stakeholders about evidence-based assessment and behavior change intervention procedures. So we're using evidence-based practices, we're advocating that everyone uses them, and then there is specific language in the code of ethics that we are to address the use of non-evidence-based practices. Okay, so this is from section 5. So if behavior analysts learn of such statements, so they're referring to deceptive statements or inaccurate statements, they make reasonable efforts to correct them. Right? And this is where I think a lot of us, it can be uncomfortable, right? But it is part of our ethical obligation, and there are strategies or ways to go about it that might be more effective than others. So that's what we'll talk about today. All right, so in terms of the first 2 points, using evidence-based practices, advocating for its use, the good news is we have a lot of evidence-based practices to draw from. And this is just one example. There's been several technical reports out there. This is just one of them. This is from the National Clearinghouse on Autism and Evidence-Based Practices. And this figure shows the trends in autism intervention research. So even if you might not be able to see it, the x-axis starts at 1990 to 2017, which is the end of the most recent report. And you could see here that the overall, there's been a great increase in terms of methodologically rigorous autism research out there. So in this report, they screen this large body of literature to only include studies that meet our methodological standards, right? For which we can be more confident about the conclusions that are drawn. So here we see that we have lots of research to draw upon, lots of high quality research, and that is continuing to grow. But again, knowing evidence-based practices, endorsing evidence-based practices may not be enough. That we also need to be prepared to address what we call unsubstantiated or non-evidence-based practices. And this is an example from rapid prompting method, which some professionals in the field describe rapid prompting method as facilitated communication reborn or facilitated communication 2.0. It is controversial, it's debatable, but there currently is no strong empirical evidence to support its effectiveness. And there is some research that actually refutes its effectiveness. So regardless, it's an unsubstantiated practice and that there's just not a large body of rigorous research to support its effectiveness. Okay. Now, the common response used by many professional organizations is to release things like position statements or press statements. Okay. And this is just a snippet from ASHA on rapid prompting method and several other organizations. APAI, right? APA, they released similar statements on rapid prompting method. And most of those statements read very similarly, like this organization does not endorse blank, 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 right? So that is one approach to handling the misinformation. But depending on what we're dealing with, it may not be the most effective in all situations. So that's what I'm going to kind of get into in the last part of this talk is what is the most effective way to address the misinformation or the use of unsubstantiated practices. Okay. Okay. So now that we have an understanding about why we're even talking about this as education professionals, let's talk about what allows misinformation, specifically related to autism, to thrive. Okay. So the internet is great. The internet allows for access to both really helpful and good information, but it can also be the breeding grounds for a lot of misinformation because anyone can post anything on the internet. There's no governing body that verifies the accuracy of what's being posted. We don't have anyone governing, nor do we necessarily want anyone governing like what we post and who posts what, right? So that means that it's a great mechanism to get lots of really helpful resources, evidence-based resources out there, but it also allows for other people to spread information, some of it good, some of it not so great. With the internet comes all of these algorithms, right? When you type in something, you will then continuously kind of see things related to the topic, right? And get feedback, right? So you're just getting inundated with kind of things that are related to or tailored to your perceived interests. The issue with that is that there is this psychological phenomenon called the illusory truth effect. And basically what this says is the more people encounter a piece of information, or in this case, a piece of misinformation that goes unchallenged, the more you're likely to start believing that this misinformation is true. So basically, the more it becomes familiar to you, even if it's not accurate, right, it's going to stick with you. And then later down the road, if a source is identified as unreliable or blatantly false, right, repeated exposure to that information might still tilt people towards believing its claim, right? So once something sticks with you, it's actually hard to get rid of it, right? And this is especially potent when we're thinking about the vast amount of exposure people have to social media right now, right? When I'm looking up something like rapid prompting method, I'm going to then be inundated because of the various algorithms in social media or, whatever my search engine is. And I'll just continue to see things about rapid prompting method. And sometimes that familiarity might lead people to believe in it more than if they were unfamiliar with the concept. Another thing that the internet allows us to do really well is to confirm our own biases. Okay? Because anyone can post anything on the internet, I guarantee we can look up anything and we'll find someone to support our position, right? We might have to dig a little bit, but chances are there's going to be someone out there who holds a similar belief to mine. Okay. And so that is one of the potential dangers, is that we can find someone to support our beliefs as opposed to refute it. And we tend to surround ourselves with people who share similar beliefs to ours, which just then, in terms of a behavioral term, it reinforces our beliefs. Okay. Right. Talked a little bit about internet improving accessibility to good things and not so good things. Right. So this is a fun study that one of actually, he was a master's student at the time. He did this for his thesis. He was really interested in understanding how people talk about different treatments on social media. And so he narrowed it down to 2 strategies that are believed to support communication. One being an evidence-based practices, so the picture exchange communication system, the other being an unsubstantiated practice, so in this case, rapid prompting method. So he basically went on Facebook, and this was back in 2016. So he did a search using specific key terms, PECS, rapid prompting method, and he looked at posts that were made between January of that year through December of that year. So he's looking at 1 year of posts using specific key terms. Found a lot. He found a total of, let's see, 668 posts on this, right? So in terms of like the exposure, like that's a lot of posts that someone might be coming across, and they were relatively equally divided, right? Around 300 about PECS, a little bit more about rapid prompting method, 374. Right? And then he wanted to look at, well, what were these posts saying? So he did what was called the sentimentality analysis, where he was looking at, are they supporting it? Are they, discouraging it? In general, there was no difference in terms of sentimentality between PECS and RPM. In general, when people posted, they felt positively about what they are posting, right? And the proportion of positive rapid prompting method posts was around 92%, and that did not differ from the proportion of positive PECS posts, right? So basically, that just means a consumer who's looking this up has equal potential to see and receive positive messages about PECS, but equally is likely to receive positive messages about rapid prompting method. Okay. What was interesting here was that he looked at the text difficulty, right? So when we, as researchers with our IRBs, oftentimes when we write consent forms, they always say you need to write it at a level, I think, of 8th grade or lower, right? To make sure that people are comprehending what you're writing. Right? So using that criterion, what was noticeable was that text posts in general were written at a much higher text difficulty level than rapid prompting method. Right? And so depending on who our audience is, right, even if they're getting kind of equal, they have the potential for equal exposure, the text used to endorse rapid prompting method is likely more comprehensible for the average consumer than those posted about PECS. Right. So we talked a little bit about the illusory truth effect, about confirmation bias, about accessibility with the internet. Another factor that allows misinformation generally to thrive, not just about autism, is that the general public we can't assume that they have a strong understanding about the scientific process. And this really came to light with COVID, right, where there was a lot of kind of skepticism, growing skepticism about science. And the issue is, or one of the issues, is that oftentimes the art of science that we appreciate and we love sometimes is turned against us. So I really like this quote from Dr. Perrick. He says, the power of science lies in continuously challenging what we think we know, right? So as scientists, we have hypotheses, we test them. And if the data shows our hypotheses aren't right, we change them, right? But to the public, if they, depending on their background and their understanding of the scientific process, all that adjusting and contradicting of findings might raise suspicion that we're incompetent, right? Or worse, that we're trying to mislead people, right? So not long ago, before the advent of the widespread access to the internet, this iterative scientific process ran largely out of the public's eye, right? We talked about it and debated it at professional conferences or, through the peer-reviewed scientific journal process. But now the public actually witnesses a lot of these discussions. And also, thanks to some pre-publication access to scientific research journals before it's fully vetted, the information gets out there that might not have gotten published before. And for those who don't have a strong understanding of the scientific process and who are seeing these things unfold, it may appear that scientists can't make up their minds, right? Or can't be trusted because they keep changing their minds. Right. Okay. Now let's talk about what we can do, right? So this all comes from a source called the Debunking Handbook. This was commissioned to bring together a bunch of experts in misinformation. Again, not specifically related to autism, but misinformation generally. It was during the COVID period. So they got a bunch of experts, really smart people together to discuss, what do we know about the cognitive processes when people are trying to interpret information and misinformation? And can we reach a consensus about what research says we should do in terms of what approaches might be most effective in this case? So I'm going to kind of divide it up into two pieces. First is what I'm calling pre-bunking. So kind of from a behavioral perspective, we always say like the best way to deal with challenging behavior is to prevent it from happening in the first place, right? So similar to that idea, the best way to dealing with misinformation is to stop it from spreading initially. And that is basically what they say. So this QR code will link you directly to that website where you can download this debunking handbook, and they have it translated in a number of languages, which I think is really neat. But basically, the way we're supposed to deal with misinformation depends on what we're dealing with. So if we expect that misinformation will get out there, but it hasn't yet gained traction, our best approach is to try to pre-bunk, right, or inoculate our audience against this misinformation. All right, so let's talk about that. So pre-bunking, inoculating. So one of the best strategies is to, of course, make sure that we are current on best practices and that we are encouraging and supporting our families, our consumers about best practices. So that way, when misinformation or contradictory information comes along, at least there'll be this cognitive clash, right? This dissonance of, oh, it's not something I've heard about. That's interesting. And they'll be more skeptical, right, to adopt it or to believe it right away. Another pre-bunking strategy is to simply warn families. So I'm imagining this is, if we're working with families who are newly diagnosed, that we just warn them that there is a lot of information out there, lots of great information, but there's a lot of misinformation out there too. Right. So just be aware that not everything is trustworthy, especially if we're going on social media. Another approach could be we anticipate they're going to hear about something. Right? So in this example, I anticipate that my families are going to do some of their own research, and they're likely going to hear about facilitated communication. right? So one approach could be, I'm going to anticipate they're going to have exposure to a specific type of misinformation, and I'm going to try to inoculate them against it, right? So similar to inoculations, vaccinations, I'm going to give them a little bit just to build up their resistance to it, right? So I might actually mention, you might hear about facilitated communication. Right? It was very popular decades ago. It's been widely disproven, and oftentimes it's believed that it's the facilitator who's controlling the information, right, or the communication. So giving them a little taste of what misinformation they might come across so that they are aware of it. Okay? Another really great debunking strategy is to just improve our overall digital literacy, because that is honestly how most people are getting their information, is through the internet. And luckily, there's lots of great available resources. Some you pay for, some are free. I just pulled this one up from University of Alberta. It's one of their big MOOCs on science literacy. The Association for Science and Autism Treatment also has some really great resources for different audiences, with tips about how to go about understanding some of the information they may come across their screens. So in addition to some of these kind of more general classes people might take, or kind of general guidance they might receive, we can also kind of boil down specific tips that we can encourage our families to think about when they're trying to process information about autism. So first is encouraging them to read past the headline, right? Especially when we're talking about media, right? Media headlines are great at creating really attention grabbing, right? Content, attention grabbing titles, right? Because gaining users' attention is a commodity in our online environment, right? They want to grab your attention. And so oftentimes it's through sensational headlines that may or may not be consistent with the actual article. But there has been some research to show that, I don't remember the exact percentage, so I don't want to mislead anyone, but a large percentage of the general public draws conclusions based on the headline alone and may not actually read the full article, right? So the first step is to make sure you encourage your clients, your families that you're working with, to read past the headline, because it may or may not be consistent with the content. Next is being critical about who's providing the information, considering the source. Again, with the internet, anyone can post anything, and some sources are more credible than others. And so considering the source is going to be especially helpful in this regard. So not only the publication outlet, but within that publication outlet, what are the credentials of the author who's saying this? What's their track record? What's their expertise, right? Do they have obvious motives or biases? Thinking about what is actually being said here. So really slowing down and thinking about, what is the information being provided? Is it plausible in light of other alternatives? A lot of times, some of the information on the internet relies heavily on anecdotal evidence. So personal stories, which are very compelling, right? They pull at your heartstrings, and things that you have an emotional response to, positive or negative, tends to stick with you, right? And so it's really easy to get caught up in the anecdotal evidence, right? But kind of taking a step back and saying, like, okay, what is actually being said here, right? Versus what am I feeling about this, is going to be helpful. And in general, telling people just to be skeptical, right? Just go into it with more of kind of a sinister skeptical lens and be convinced. But the default should be, I'm not going to believe you until you convince me otherwise. And then encouraging our consumers to fact check it against a third party, Right? So this idea of lateral reading, checking other sources to evaluate the credibility of the site, right? Rather than just trying to analyze the site ourselves, right? Which some of us would like to do, others don't. But another way to kind of do that is by looking at, are there other credible sites who are saying similar things or endorsing similar strategies, right? Then I can be more confident that this might be something that I might adopt or use. Okay. So at this point, I thought it might be fun for you to stop listening to me talk and crowdsource. So fact checking against a third party, I think is easier said than done. And it can become easier if we can actually give our consumers credible sources to check. So one of the activities that I always like to do with some of our teacher preparation programs, I teach a course on strategies for students with autism. They do an activity in which I have them identify different sources that they might be able to recommend to their students' families. So I was thinking, I created a Jamboard. I think amongst us in this audience, there's probably a lot of really great information that we have amongst ourselves and sources that we oftentimes refer to. So I created a Jamboard so we can link those sources. And at the end, we'll curate a list of reliable sources that we may want to keep and disseminate to our clients, our consumers. All right, so I'm going to try to figure out how to do this. I'm gonna put the link in the chat here. All right, bear with me. Okay, hopefully this worked out okay. So if you click on that link, it should take you to a Jamboard. And for those who are unfamiliar with Jamboard, there is a menu on the left side that you can put like what looks like a Post-it note, and you can just put in the different resources that you tend to go to or recommend. Oh, it says you need access. Let me see. All right. Anyone with the link? Okay. All right, so I think I changed the access. Does that work better for you? All right, great. So let's just spend a few minutes. If you have some sources that you really like to turn to, we can share it. And again, the idea is that we're going to curate a list of resources that we might be able to save and share with our clients or families. And so at this point, we are at it's 1:45 my time. So we're about halfway through. Um, so I think this is a good time for a little stretch break. So if you want to keep adding resources, great. But let's take a 5-minute stretch break. So that would mean, looking at time here, so 1:42 my time. If we can come back around 1:47-ish my time, which is, oh gosh, is that your time? 11:47?
10. Pardon me, 10.
10. Okay. So some people are still saying they don't have permission. Let me see if I can figure that out. If not, just, oh, it's because you're a viewer. I'm going to put you as an editor. There we go. Now, I think we got it. So if we could just add some Post-its if you would like, and then come on back in about 5 minutes, and then we'll resume. All right, so I have at 1:48 my time. So if we could start coming back, that would be great, and we will continue with our talk. So I do want to spend some time going back to the second tip here, which is considering the source. So I want to share a study that I did with some colleagues a few years ago. This was when I was still faculty at University of Minnesota. We were really interested in understanding how different factors influences the public's perception of autism treatments. So this is the QR code if you're interested in actually accessing the full article. Uh, so as I mentioned, this was when I was faculty still at University of Minnesota. One of the really great things that University of Minnesota did was they actually had a research tent that they would set up at the annual state fair, which is a very popular thing in Minnesota. And I don't think I was quite prepared for how popular it was because it was my first time in the Midwest. And I thought I've been to lots of state fairs before. I should know what to expect. But their state fair is like the next level popular. So anyways, they have this a research booth, right, a research tent that hosts different tables where faculty and students who are conducting low risk studies can apply and get a table, and people will come through the booth and you can have them complete your low risk studies. So this was where we decided to get a sample of the general public and have them complete some surveys to help us better understand how different variables might impact their interpretation of practices that are used in the autism field. And specifically, we were looking at treatment status, so whether it's something that is evidence-based versus something that's unsubstantiated, as well as the credibility of the source. So if it's a practice that's being endorsed by someone who's viewed as credible versus someone who is endorsing a practice, but they're considered a not credible source. Okay. So these are just some of my students in front of the booth. Oh, there we go. So I mentioned that this is a great place to get a potentially representative sample of the area's public population. This picture here is just the regular weekend at the state fair. So it is very, very well attended. I think we were there for 4 days recruiting, and we had over 600 people fill out our survey. Now, not all of the survey responses were usable. In our survey, we also wanted to make sure that people were actually paying attention to when they were reading it, not just kind of going through. So we did have attention checks embedded throughout. So if they failed the attention check or if they didn't finish the survey, it was excluded from final analysis. So our final sample included 379 completed surveys, and by completed surveys, it was those that still passed the attention check throughout. Average age, 45, right? Mostly female, but got some male respondents. So even though one of the appealing things about doing this at the state fair was that we thought that we would get a representative sample, there's still a biased sample that comes through a research building at a state fair. Right? And I think that's what we see here is that, we were in the Midwest, so we did expect a larger proportion of white citizens coming through. Our overall percent or proportion of respondents who self-reported as white was almost 97%. So predominantly white respondent population, and a highly educated population. So 67% had a bachelor's degree or higher. Okay. So that, of course, we have to keep that in mind when we're kind of thinking about the implications of this and the potential external validity or the ability to generalize our findings. Okay. Right. So I mentioned we were interested in looking at variables that can affect public's perception of treatments. And so in this study, we were looking at treatment status, which had, so that's what we call like so it was basically a 2x2 factorial design. Okay, so we had two independent variables, right? The first independent variable being treatment status, second independent variable being the source credibility. And for each of those independent variables, there were two levels. Right? So treatment status, you could either have non-evidence-based treatments, and the second level was evidence-based treatments. Source credibility, we had credible sources, and then the second level was incredible sources. Right? And these sources were taken from some previous research about the general public and who they ranked as being more credible and who is not credible. Okay. So survey design was set up like a 2x2 factorial design. We had alternate versions of the survey that were randomly distributed to participants as they came through our research booth. But the design of the study was the same. So in summary, everyone read the same descriptions and the same numbers of treatment. We presented 4 treatments that were evidence-based, 4 that were unsubstantiated. And then we also, though, alternated who was providing that information. So in some surveys, it would be a credible source providing that information. In the alternate survey, it was a non-credible source presenting the same information. Okay. Right. So here's an example of what one might look like. So this is an example of a credible source who is providing information about an unsubstantiated treatment, which is the pressure-weighted vests. So you don't have to necessarily read it, but they all follow the same structure, where it would say, so-and-so explained, right? And then there'd be about a paragraph that explained the treatment, right? And we tried to control for length and kind of also the text difficulty to make sure that everything was controlled for or equally balanced across the different explanations. Okay. So every participant would have the survey. It was delivered on tablets, right? They would read it and and then after reading each description, they would answer the same questions. They would respond to on a scale of 1 to 5, right? Well, sorry, let me back up. So first we would ask them, just like dichotomous, yes, no, are you familiar with this practice? Right. Then we would ask them on a scale of 1 to 5, would you recommend this practice? And a scale from 1 to 5, how likely are you to believe this practice would work? Okay. So in terms of familiarity, the black bars refer to practices that are supported by research, so our evidence-based practices. The light bars were our non-evidence-based practices that were described. Okay. When we analyze non-evidence-based practices against evidence-based practices, when you compare the means, overall, the general public was more familiar with the non-evidence-based practices than evidence-based practices. But again, because we are comparing means, you can see here that might be due to, here we go, the large proportion of people who were familiar with gluten-free casein-free diets, right? That skewed the overall mean, right? So statistically, the general public was more familiar with non-evidence-based practices compared to evidence-based practices. But if we were to exclude gluten-free casein-free diets, there likely would not be a significant difference, meaning that the general public would be as familiar with either. So that was not really, well, in part that was a little bit surprising because one of the characteristics of pseudoscientific or non-evidence-based practices is that it is something that is oftentimes well known by people because it's used to treat other ailments or other disability behaviors, right? Or other behaviors or symptoms. So something like casein-free, gluten-free diets, like if you have celiac disease, that is a legitimate treatment, right? So people might have heard of it because they might know someone who does have that dietary restriction, right? But one of the kind of trademark hallmarks of some of these pseudoscientific practices is it will help with autism symptoms as well as ADHD, as well as, people who have digestive issues. So we hypothesized that the general public might actually be more familiar with unsubstantiated practices simply because of that, because they are widespread used and actually legitimately used in some cases. Then we wanted to look at how likely would you be to recommend this treatment? Okay, so the question was, I would recommend X practice for individuals with autism, scale of 1 to 5, 1 being extremely unlikely to recommend, 5 being extremely likely to recommend. So here we're seeing kind of a similar pattern across the two. In general, when we statistically analyze this, evidence-based practices received higher levels of recommendation compared to non-evidence-based practices. Right. So again, this is kind of what I like to, when I talk with my students about, we hear sometimes the difference between being statistically significant as well as actually being meaningfully significant, right? So technically this is statistically significant, that these means are different from each other. But the reality is they're all around between 3 and 4, meaning like, yeah, I might recommend it. So in any case, the general public statistically would recommend evidence-based practices more likely than non-evidence-based practices. In terms of whether or not source credibility matters, that was not a statistically significant difference. Okay. So stated another way, they're likely to recommend evidence-based practices regardless of who is giving them the information. It did not matter whether it was a doctor giving them the information that they read or a celebrity giving them the information they read. Right. So they were drawing their conclusions primarily on the evidentiary basis of it, as opposed to attending to who was saying it, or at least who was saying it did not differentially influence their responses. Okay. So we introduced a manipulation condition. We actually were curious if we actually tell people, hey, pay attention to the source, will that make a difference in their responses? Okay, so essentially we added another independent variable here. So we have now a 2 by 2 by 2 factorial design where we're now manipulating it. We're randomly selecting some people to say, hey, pay attention to the source. And the other ones, we're just not giving them that information. Like, here, read this information. Okay. Now, when we intentionally tell people or encourage them to focus on the source, we do see some changes here for non-credible sources. Okay. So in the manipulation condition, where we actually say, hey, pay attention to the source, it made a difference when the source was a not credible source. Okay. So if it was a not credible source endorsing an evidence-based practices, then they were less likely or less strongly to recommend it, right? Similarly, if it was a non-credible source recommending a non-evidence-based practice, they were less likely to recommend it compared to the individuals who responded to the no manipulation condition. That pattern did not hold for credible sources. So if it was a credible source, it really did not make a difference, right? Whether it was a non-evidence-based practice or an evidence-based practice in that manipulation condition. Right. So here, I'm going to zoom in on just one of the practices, the pressure-weighted vest, to just show it a different way. So individuals who were assigned to the no manipulation condition, meaning they just filled out the survey without us giving them extra direction, they are just as likely to produce similar recommendation ratings if it's a celebrity versus a physician. But in the manipulation condition, those who read about weighted vests being endorsed from a celebrity rated it lower than if it was introduced by a physician. So that was just a lot of kind of information. So I do give you that link to the article, which explains it much more eloquently than I just did there. But the take-home message is that people are, even though they're statistically more familiar with non-evidence-based practices, socially significantly, like they're equally, there's no real difference. They hear about evidence-based practices, they also hear about non-evidence-based practices. So what does that mean for us in the academy, or those of us who are educational professionals talking about practices and treatment options? It does matter in terms of improving or increasing our dissemination efforts to public audiences, particularly around evidence-based practices. Because remember when I talked a little bit about the illusory truth effect, that the more familiar something is, the more likely someone's going to believe it. Right. In general, in academia, our dissemination efforts primarily kind of exist amongst us in the academy, right? Through peer-reviewed journals, through professional conferences, right? And honestly, that is what is reinforced, that is what is valued in the academy, right? We don't get tenure by just talking with the public generally, right? We have to publish, and we have to publish in kind of specific outlets, right? But that does not necessarily translate to our public audiences. So thinking about how do we, as a research community, do better and place more value on making sure that our messages are written in a way that are accessible to the public consumers that we eventually want to reach. This study also may indicate that training, when we are training and providing professional development or providing informational sessions to our clients and our consumers, that we do need to emphasize the importance of sourcing. Because remember, even just drawing the, that was not a fancy manipulation. We just said, hey, pay attention to the source, right? So encouraging folks to pay attention to the source may be helpful in helping them think critically about the veracity of the information they're receiving. Right. So we have our pre-bunking strategies, right? That ideally we can kind of stop it before it gains too much traction. We're going to prevent misinformation from spreading in the first place. But the reality is misinformation is out there and it's going to catch on with some audiences, right? So what do we do once it's already out there and people have started forming false beliefs related to that misinformation? Well, I'm going to refer to our debunking handbook again here. So we have our misinformation. It's out there, right? But one thing we want to ask is, well, how widespread is it, right? If it's something that's relatively new, it hasn't really gained traction, let's just monitor it. Let's just keep an eye on it, right? But no need to kind of exaggerate or like respond to things if we don't need to, right? So just keep an eye on it. If misinformation is out there and it's starting to gain traction, right, we need to ask, well, have people actually developed firm false beliefs related to it? Because it could be the case of, a parent comes to us and says, I've heard about X, Y, or Z, don't really know how I feel about it, right? What we do with that is very different than someone who comes to us saying, I firmly believe X, Y, or Z. Okay. So if we are working with the case of someone who has heard about this information, but it is still possible to kind of what they say, set the agenda, right? It's still possible that they don't have a firm false belief yet. The best strategy is simply to provide the right information, the accurate information, and withhold any debunking, which we're going to talk about next, right? So again, the first thing, our best course of action would be simply to provide the accurate information. Kind of pull, like, it's similar to thinking about that illusory truth effect, right? We don't necessarily want to draw more attention to something and reinforce something in people's minds that isn't there yet, right? So I don't necessarily want to kind of draw or any more attention to the misinformation that is needed. Right? Instead, I'm just going to tell you all, I'm going to tell you the replacement. I'm going to tell you what we do know and what the right information is. But if we are faced with a situation where misinformation is out there, it's gaining traction, and we are working with an audience that has firm false beliefs, right? What can we do? Sometimes nothing, right? And that's the reality, is sometimes nothing, right? But sometimes there might be some things we might be able to do. So Pani Kendu is a cognitive scientist at the University of Minnesota. She is actually one of the authors on the debunking handbook and a really great colleague who worked on the survey study at the state fair with me. So she always says that, our goal at this point is not, we can't erase and replace misconceptions that people have acquired. They're there, right? But our best hope and what our goal should be is to try to reduce the negative impact that might result from the misinformation, right? Because we're not really in the business of changing people's beliefs. So she says, the first thing is to make sure that we're using a credible debunker, right? Who is engaging in this conversation makes a difference. Someone who is viewed as being a credible source of information is a combination of someone who the audience views as trustworthy, as well as someone who holds expertise in that content. And together, that makes the most credible person. So it is very possible that someone out there, and I'm thinking when I was at Minnesota, they have a large Hmong community, and who, understandably so and rightfully so, have some skepticism with the medical community, as well as the academic community, right? So they may argue, sure, these researchers have expertise, but I'm not going to trust them, right? So we are not necessarily the best people to be leading the conversation here, right? Instead, we need to find someone who is viewed as being more trustworthy by that community, who also has the expertise, or that we can help provide the expertise to. So the likelihood of debunking a false belief starts with using a credible debunker. Right. Then the approach that we take, I kind of call this like my fact sandwich. So I start off with what we know. Okay, I'm going to lead with the fact. Hopefully I can say it in a way that's clear and will stick with them. Okay, I'm going to start with my fact. Right? Then I'm going to allude to the misinformation or the false belief. And here it's really important to understand that these false beliefs, they don't come out of thin air. They start from something, right? So we need to really think about and understand what information are people using to arrive at this false belief, right? And when we do that, then we can better address it, right? We can not only warn about this is out there, right? Or this is a commonly held false belief, but we can then explain why that misinformation is wrong, right? Based on what they believe is true. And then we end with the fact. So I'm looking at time here. I wanted to show an example. I filmed something for one of my classes. So I was going to show a video of me doing an example of addressing the false belief that that autism is an epidemic. So I think when I try to do it, we can always stop if we run out of time. So I'm going to stop this.
Sounds good to me. While you're pulling that up, I can give you all the second code word, which you will need for the feedback form if you want to get CEUs. The second word is going to be pastry. Pastry is the second code word.
Just fast forwarding it to the right place so we're not wasting too much time here. Okay. I'm gonna share my screen one more time. Oh, I actually want to share it with the sound. Sorry. Let me do that again. Sound. Example. Right. So the Center for Disease Control just released an updated prevalence of autism based on their most current surveillance methods. Right. Currently, autism, the autism prevalence is now 1 in 36 children. Whenever the CDC releases autism prevalence rates, there's always a reaction of a subset of people who panic, right? And these numbers are at face value scary. And they develop this false belief that autism is on the rise and the rise in cases is significant. And I've often heard the word epidemic used in conjunction with the increased prevalence of autism over the years. So that is the false belief, that they really believe that autism is on the rise, it's reaching epidemic levels. Now, the important thing to acknowledge is that this false belief came from somewhere. And in order to develop a strong refutation explanation, we need to understand what was the source that led them to develop this false belief. And in this example, I'm going to say that the misinformation is really a misinterpretation or an inaccurate interpretation of the surveillance data and what it truly means. All right. So I'm going to develop a refutation explanation based on this premise. So the first step in an effective refutation explanation is to state the fact. Again, I'm going to try to do it in as few words and clear words as possible, but I'm going to lead with what we know. Okay. So what we know is the Center for Disease Control currently estimates that the prevalence of autism is now 1 in 36 children. This is an increase from the last surveillance, which was done in 2018, in which they estimated 1 in 44 children have autism. So that is the fact. But now I'm going to introduce and warn you about the myths. Right? These numbers have caused some people to panic, believing that autism is an epidemic and cases are on the rise. Now let's talk about what prevalence really means and how it's different than incidence. Incidence refers to new cases of a disease or a disorder, whereas prevalence refers to overall cases. Now, these terms are usually used in the medical field, in which oftentimes overall prevalence is oftentimes balanced out because there are people who may be cured or who have died from the disease, right? And in that sense, when people, the number of deaths or recoveries serve as a counterbalance for any new cases that come in. Now, with autism, we know that it is a lifelong disorder. There is not a cure. And so that means whenever there are any new cases, that will lead to an overall increase in prevalence because we're not losing kids who were previously diagnosed. There are not cases in which kids are cured or who are perishing at a rate to counterbalance the number of new cases that are coming in, right? So it's important to remember that prevalence is not the same as incidence.
But there are things that we can use to explain the overall increase in prevalence. We know that in general, we have much stronger and better awareness of autism. We have improvements in overall screening, developmental screenings, and our evaluation tools. There's a reduced stigma, which means more and more families are more likely to pursue an evaluation if they have concerns about their child. And importantly, the criteria or the definition of autism has broadened over the years. So it's not fair to compare data that is collected now on autism versus data that was collected 30 years ago in autism, because our definition has changed. How we conceive of autism has broadened significantly. Right? So overall, this means that yes, autism prevalence rates are what they are. They are at 1 in 36 children. But we need to remember that increased incidence is possible, but can't explain the increased prevalence, which can be more accurately explained by alternate factors, in particular, improving our screening processes and evaluation tools. Right? So in layman's terms, the numbers that we're seeing now from the Center for Disease Control most likely reflect that we have cases that have always been there, and we're just getting better at finding them. So in summary, when we're making a debunking statement or a refutation explanation, you want to try to include 4 components: leading with the truth, acknowledging the myth, explaining why that information that led that person to develop the false beliefs is wrong, and then reinforcing and ending with the fact, and whenever possible, providing an alternative explanation. When we're making refutation explanations, we want to make sure as much as possible that we're avoiding scientific jargon or complex technical language. It's always helpful to combine explanations with well-designed graphs, videos, photos, or other types of semantic aids to help convey the correction. And remember that the truth is oftentimes more complicated than the viral false claim. So you must invest effort into translating these ideas so that they're readily accessible to your target audience. We want to make sure that your audience can easily read it if it's something that you're printing, or if we want them to be able to imagine or recall the information that you use in your refutation explanation.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and try to find my slide deck again. Let's see here. Okay. Here we are. We are nearing the end of our time together. So we have our general guidelines, which I talked about. So here we are. So that was actually my last activity that we were going to do. So I'm just revisiting our objectives that I introduced at the start of the talk. So I'm hoping that if I've done my job right, you have a sense of why we as educational professionals should address misinformation. We have an understanding of different factors that might facilitate the spread of misinformation. And hopefully you're able to walk away with some things to think about in terms of strategies to pre-bunk as well as debunk false beliefs that might stem from this misinformation. So I think I've left just a few minutes, and I apologize for that. It's less time than I thought I would, but we do have some minutes or some time before we are done here. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask me, you can stick it either in the chat or maybe raise your hand, and we can call on people. I have about 5 minutes or so for some questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see your faces.
Thank you so much, Veronica. This was so helpful. I'm a medical person. I'm not an educator, but I'm fortunate to spend time in schools. And I think this is really a topic that is not part of our medical education at the undergraduate level or postgraduate level. And I see my colleagues struggling. I think we are all struggling to continue to do this work as expert diagnosticians. And in British Columbia, we use both the diagnostic interview and the observation schedule. So we set a very high bar for ourselves to address the diagnosis aspect of things. So we hope we're not inflating the prevalence rate needlessly, but I am definitely charged up to not only present the paper that you sent us the QR code for as part of our journal club to our trainees, but also to disseminate the disinformation handbook to my colleagues as well. So I'm really, really happy that I attended today. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for joining. And I love that you are not part of kind of our special education classroom audience, because misinformation and autism, so many different disciplines are working together really for the same purpose of really just trying to support the autism community, right? Giving them the supports that they need. Yeah, and what I really like about the debunking handbook and this approach is really this acknowledgement of the false beliefs don't come out of nowhere, right? There is a reason why people think this. And it is really, if we're going to make any difference or even have a conversation about it, we do need to take some time just to listen and to understand, what are people experiencing? What are people thinking? Right? Otherwise, it's just going to be kind of us butting heads and saying, like, we're doing this and we're doing this, right? As opposed to trying to really have a conversation, as opposed to just an argument. And that all stems from acknowledging that I'm not making this up, right? I may be basing it on information that is inaccurate, but I may not know that yet. And I may be more open to talking about it if I don't feel like I'm attacked. So if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. I'm going to share my screen because Vicky reminded me that there is one more slide that I need to share with you all, especially if you are earning BCBA credits. Here's my email too, if you think of something later and you want to reach out, you can reach me. Oh, there we go. There's the slide.
Okay, so our last code word for today is cookie. Cookie is our last code word. So please provide feedback for this session and also obtain your BACB CEUs. You can either use the tiny URL link, or you can use the QR code. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with QR codes, you're gonna go to your camera on your phone or other device and act like you're going to take a picture of the QR code, and it will actually bring you up to a site that will take you to the feedback form, directly to the feedback form. And it's very brief. There are some required questions, and you are welcome to fill it out, even if you're not here for BACB CEUs. And you really enjoyed the session, or you have some feedback for us as well. One of the things that I added for those of you that have returned from other CIRCA sessions is if you have recommendations for topics that you would like covered, and or presenters that I might be able to recruit to present. I have very little to offer in terms of recruitment, so it's a very tiny stipend, so bear that in mind. But yeah, I'm definitely open to any of that. And while you're doing that, please, let Veronica know, or Dr. Fleury know, how things went. If you have other questions, we have a couple of minutes for that. Yes, there is a mailing list. It's the CIRCA listserv, and it is actually on the form. It will ask you if you want to be part of the listserv. And so just say yes and I'll add you. Easy. Oh, and I can stop recording.